What if I told you that one of history's most powerful rulers built her empire on secrets that would shock the world? History books celebrate Catherine the Great as an enlightened monarch who transformed Russia into a European superpower. But what they don't tell you is the forbidden story behind her rise to power. This is the hidden history of palace intrigue, dangerous alliances, and relationships that scandalized European royalty. Some involved generals, some involved nobles, and some involved people the royal court would never have approved of. This is Catherine the Great, the untold version. And trust me, your history teacher never told you this story. Our story begins in 1744, not in Russia, but in a minor German principality. Princess Sophia Augusta Frederica was just 15 years old when her life changed forever. She wasn't beautiful by the standards of the time. She wasn't particularly wealthy. Her family was practically broke. But she had something that Empress Elizabeth of Russia desperately needed. She was young, fertile, and completely expendable. You see, Elizabeth had a problem. Her nephew and heir, Grand Duke Peter, was 16 years old and, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly Prince Charming. Contemporary accounts describe him as immature, unpredictable, and obsessed with playing with toy soldiers. He had no interest in Russia, idolized Prussia instead, and spent most of his time drinking with his military friends. The Empress needed someone, anyone, who could tolerate this bizarre young man long enough to produce an heir. Enter Sophia. The young German princess arrived in St. Petersburg in February 1744. It was freezing. She spoke no Russian. She knew nothing about Orthodox Christianity. And when she first laid eyes on her future husband, she was horrified. Peter was shorter than her, had a face scarred by smallpox, and was, according to her later writings, disagreeable in every possible way. But Sophia was smart, very smart. She realized immediately that her survival depended on making herself indispensable to the Russian court. While Peter stubbornly refused to learn Russian or convert to Orthodoxy, Sophia threw herself into both. She studied Russian for hours every day, often pacing the cold palace corridors at night, memorizing vocabulary until she collapsed from exhaustion. She caught pneumonia and nearly died, but even from her sickbed, she kept studying. The Russian people loved her for it. In June 1744, she converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity and took a new name, Yekaterina, or Catherine. 1 year later, on August 21st, 1745, 16-year-old Catherine married 17-year-old Grand Duke Peter in a lavish ceremony at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan. The entire Russian court attended. Fireworks lit up the St. Petersburg sky. It was a fairy tale wedding, except for one problem. The marriage was a complete disaster from day one. Peter had no interest in his wife. He preferred spending time with his military companion. Catherine spent her wedding night alone in a massive palace bedroom, while her husband celebrated with his friends in another wing of the palace. For 9 years, Catherine's life was a nightmare. 9 years without producing an heir. 9 years of humiliation. The Russian court whispered that she must be unable to have children. Empress Elizabeth grew increasingly frustrated. She needed a grandson to secure the succession. She didn't particularly care how she got one. And that's when things get interesting, because according to Catherine's own memoirs, written decades later, the Empress essentially gave her permission to find another way to secure the succession. Not explicitly, of course, but the message was clear. Get pregnant. I don't care how. Catherine's first serious relationship outside her marriage was with Sergei Saltykov, a handsome Russian nobleman with dark eyes and a reputation as a charmer. He was 26. She was 21, and she was desperately lonely. Their connection began in 1752, and Catherine later described him as irresistible. Whether she genuinely cared for him or simply needed companionship is unclear, but what is clear is that in 1754, 9 years into her barren marriage, Catherine suddenly became pregnant. On September 20th, 1754, she gave birth to a son, the future Emperor Paul I. The entire Russian court celebrated. Empress Elizabeth was thrilled. There was just one problem. Peter, Catherine's husband, had no idea if the child was actually his, and based on the timeline and circumstances, it probably wasn't. But here's where Catherine's genius comes into play. She never admitted anything, not publicly, not in writing. She let everyone believe what they wanted to believe. Peter, delusional as ever, accepted Paul as his son. Empress Elizabeth certainly didn't care about the details. She had her heir, that's all that mattered. And Catherine, well, Catherine had just learned an incredibly valuable lesson. Power in the Russian court didn't come from legitimacy. It came from cleverness, timing, and knowing exactly who to trust. After giving birth to Paul, Catherine's marriage to Peter became even more of a disaster. They lived in separate wings of the palace. They barely spoke. Peter openly flaunted his own romantic interests, the most prominent being Elizabeth Vorontsova, a woman so unremarkable that the court couldn't understand his attraction to her. Meanwhile, Catherine moved on from Saltykov, who was conveniently sent away on a diplomatic mission, probably at Empress Elizabeth's orders. Catherine needed to be more careful, but discretion was never really her style. Enter Stanisław Poniatowski, a handsome young Polish nobleman who arrived at the Russian court as part of a diplomatic delegation in 1755. He was 23, she was 26, and unlike her previous companion, Poniatowski was cultured, educated, and ambitious. Their connection was passionate and, for a while, almost romantic. Catherine wrote him letters. They discussed philosophy and politics. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt intellectually stimulated. In 1757, she gave birth to a daughter, Anna, who almost certainly was Poniatowski's child. The baby died in infancy, which was probably fortunate for Catherine, because questions about the child's paternity were already circulating around the court. But Catherine wasn't done. In 1758, she began another relationship with a young officer, and in 1762, she gave birth to another son, Alexei Bobrinskoy, who definitely wasn't Peter's. By this point, everyone at court knew Catherine was forming alliances outside her marriage. Peter knew, Empress Elizabeth knew, foreign ambassadors knew, but no one did anything about it. Why? Because Catherine was smart enough to keep her relationships within the acceptable boundaries of court intrigue. And more importantly, because by 1761, everything was about to change. Empress Elizabeth died on December 25, 1761. Peter, Catherine's incompetent, alcoholic, possibly unstable husband, became Emperor Peter III, and Russia was about to descend into chaos. Peter immediately set about alienating everyone. He pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War just as they were winning, purely because he idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia. He insulted the Orthodox Church. He threatened to divorce Catherine and send her to a convent. He talked openly about disinheriting their son Paul. The Russian nobility, the military, and the church all despised him. Peter III had been emperor for exactly 6 months, and Catherine was about to make her move. This brings us to the most dramatic and most fascinating part of Catherine's story, because the man who helped her overthrow her husband and seize the throne of Russia wasn't a general, wasn't a high-ranking nobleman, and wasn't even someone most historians emphasize. His name was Grigory Orlov, and when Catherine first encountered him in 1760, Orlov was a relatively low-ranking artillery officer in the Imperial Guard. Now, here's where historical records get interesting and where the real intrigue begins. Official histories describe Grigory Orlov as a military officer, technically true. But what they don't emphasize is that when Catherine met him, Orlov was essentially palace security. He was tall, over 6 feet, incredibly strong, and devastatingly handsome. He had 5 brothers, all of them officers in the Imperial Guard, all of them fiercely loyal to each other. And Catherine saw in Grigory Orlov exactly what she needed, not just a companion, but a weapon. Their connection began sometime in 1760 or 1761. By all accounts, it was intensely passionate. Catherine was 31, Orlov was 26, and unlike her previous companion, who were cultured and intellectual, Orlov was raw, powerful, and dangerous. He wasn't interested in philosophy or politics. He was a soldier, and Catherine was fascinated by him. In April 1762, while Peter was emperor and Catherine's life was in danger, she gave birth to Orlov's son, Alexei Bobrinskoy. She hid the pregnancy under heavy dresses and gave birth in secret. The baby was smuggled out of the palace and raised by a trusted servant. Peter never knew. But Orlov wasn't just Catherine's companion. He was her co-conspirator. And in June 1762, he helped her pull off one of the most audacious coups in European history. Peter had gone to his summer palace, drunk as usual, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was about to destroy him. On the night of June 27, 1762, Catherine was at her own estate, Peterhof, when Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, arrived in the middle of the night. The Imperial Guard was ready to declare for Catherine. It was time to move. Catherine rode into St. Petersburg at dawn, wearing a male officer's uniform borrowed from the Orlov brothers. She arrived at the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment, and the soldiers, who despised Peter, immediately knelt before her and declared her empress. Regiment after regiment followed. By noon, Catherine had control of the entire imperial guard, 14,000 soldiers, all of them ready to fight for her. She rode to the Winter Palace and was proclaimed Empress Catherine II by the Senate, the Church, and the people of St. Petersburg. Peter, still at his summer palace, had no idea what was happening until it was too late. When he finally realized his wife had overthrown him, he tried to flee, then tried to negotiate, then finally just collapsed and signed his abdication. He was arrested and imprisoned in a small estate called Ropsha. 8 days later, he was dead. The official story was that Peter died of natural causes, specifically hemorrhoidal colic, but no one believed that. Most historians agree that Peter was murdered, and the man who probably carried it out was Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, the same man who rode through the night to warn Catherine the coup was ready. Catherine later claimed she had nothing to do with Peter's death. Maybe that's true. Maybe she genuinely wanted him to live out his days in quiet exile. Or maybe she knew exactly what Alexei Orlov was going to do and simply chose not to stop him. Either way, Peter was dead and Catherine was empress. Now here's the part that really scandalized Europe. Catherine didn't just take the throne. She rewarded her allies generously. Grigory Orlov was made a count, given vast estates, showered with money and title. His brothers all became generals and senators. For the next 10 years, Grigory Orlov was essentially the uncrowned king of Russia. He lived in the Winter Palace. He attended state meetings. Foreign ambassadors had to court his favor, and everyone knew, that the Empress of Russia had elevated a man who, just a few years earlier, had been little more than a palace guard. But Catherine's appetite for power was matched only by her need for intellectual stimulation. And Grigory Orlov, for all his physical prowess, was not an intellectual match for the Empress. By the late 1760s, Catherine had grown bored. She wanted someone who could challenge her mind as well as her ambitions. She found him in Grigory Potemkin, and this relationship would become the most significant of her entire life. Grigory Potemkin was nothing like Orlov. He was tall, yes, and striking in appearance, but he was also brilliant, educated, ambitious, and possibly unstable. He had lost an eye in a confrontation, which gave him a dangerous, memorable look. He was moody, unpredictable, prone to fits of depression, where he would lock himself in his room for days. He was also one of the greatest political and military minds Russia had ever produced, and Catherine was drawn to him intensely. Their relationship began in 1774, after Catherine had finally dismissed Grigory Orlov. But calling it a simple relationship doesn't really capture the intensity of their bond. Catherine and Potemkin wrote each other hundreds of letters, many of which still survive. They're shockingly intimate. Catherine calls him my darling, my soul, my marble beauty. Potemkin calls her Matushka, little mother, but also my goddess and my life. Some historians believe they secretly married in 1775, though there's no definitive proof. What is certain is that for the rest of Catherine's life, even after their romantic connection ended, Potemkin remained her most trusted advisor, the architect of her greatest achievements. Under Potemkin's guidance, Catherine expanded Russian territory massively, annexing Crimea, conquering the northern coast of the Black Sea, and pushing Russia's borders south and west. Potemkin built cities, founded the Black Sea Fleet, and effectively created modern southern Russia. And all the while, he and Catherine maintained their strange, intense partnership. When their romantic relationship ended around 1776, Potemkin didn't disappear. Instead, he became something even more valuable to Catherine. He became her partner in power. And in a move that shocked the Russian court, Potemkin began selecting Catherine's future companions for her. Yes, you heard that right. For the next 20 years, Grigory Potemkin essentially ran a screening process for potential romantic interests for the Empress. Young, handsome officers would be brought to Potemkin's attention. He would vet them, make sure they weren't spies or threats, and if they passed his tests, he would introduce them to Catherine. This arrangement sounds bizarre to modern ears, but it worked. Catherine got companionship without the risk of political scandal, and Potemkin ensured that no rival would ever threaten his own position as her chief advisor. The men Potemkin selected were known as the favorite, and there were many of them. Peter Zavodovsky, an educated Ukrainian who served for 2 years. Simon Zorik, a Serbian soldier. Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, a 19-year-old guards officer when Catherine was 48. Alexander Lanskoy, who Catherine genuinely cared for and who died suddenly at 26, leaving her devastated. These men were given titles, estates, and enormous wealth. When their time as favorite ended, they were pensioned off with generous gifts and sent away. It was, in its own strange way, a highly efficient system. But here's what makes this story even more intriguing. While Potemkin was selecting educated officers and noblemen for Catherine, there are persistent rumors, whispered in diplomatic reports and memoirs, that Catherine also formed connections with men of much lower status, servants, common soldiers, even, according to some sources, palace workers and guards. These relationships were never official. They were never recorded in state documents. But the rumors persisted. Why? Because Catherine, unlike other monarchs, didn't particularly care about social rank when it came to her private life. She believed, quite radically for her time, that intelligence and character mattered more than birth. There's a famous, probably exaggerated story about Catherine encountering a young guardsman during a walk through the palace gardens. They conversed. She was impressed by his wit and insight. And by morning, he had been promoted to lieutenant and given new quarters in the palace. True, maybe not. But the fact that such stories circulated and were believed tells you everything you need to know about Catherine's reputation and how she defied the social norms of her era. By the 1780s, Catherine was in her 50s, still taking young companions, still ruling Russia with an iron fist, and still scandalizing Europe. Her final favorite was Platon Zubov, a 22-year-old officer when Catherine was 60. He was beautiful, ambitious, and ruthless. He effectively controlled access to the Empress in her final years, and many at court despised him. When Potemkin died in 1791, Catherine was heartbroken, but Zubov filled some of the void, at least in terms of companionship. Intellectually, no one could replace Potemkin. Catherine the Great died on November 6, 1796, at the age of 67. The official cause was a stroke, but of course, rumors swirled immediately. Some claimed she died in her private chambers. Some claimed she died while with Zubov. And the most scandalous rumor, which persists even today, claimed she died while attempting something truly bizarre with a horse. This rumor is completely, utterly false. It was invented by her enemies, particularly French revolutionaries, who hated everything Catherine represented. But the fact that people believed it, and still reference it today, shows just how controversial Catherine's reputation had become. So what's the truth about Catherine the Great? Was she an enlightened monarch who transformed Russia? Yes. Was she a ruthless political operator who possibly had her husband eliminated? Also yes. Was she a woman who defied every social norm of her time by openly forming relationships with men, sometimes from outside the nobility? Absolutely. And that's what makes her story so fascinating. Because Catherine didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them. She proved that a woman could rule one of the world's great powers, could command armies, could expand empires, and could do it all while living exactly as she pleased. History books remember Catherine the Great as an enlightened despot, a patron of the arts, a correspondent of Voltaire, the empress who brought Western culture to Russia. And all of that is true. But the hidden history, the truth that gets left out of textbooks, is that Catherine built her empire on a foundation of strategic alliances, political cunning, and relationships that would have destroyed any other monarch. She formed connections with officers and possibly common soldiers. She probably had her husband eliminated. She took dozens of companions over 30 years, and she got away with all of it because she was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely fearless. The next time you see a portrait of Catherine the Great in her imperial robes, crown on her head, scepter in hand, looking every inch the enlightened monarch, remember this: that woman started as an unwanted German princess, survived a disastrous marriage to an unstable ruler, built alliances with the right people at the right time, launched a coup, and ruled Russia for 34 years. She wasn't just a great ruler. She was a survivor. And her story, the real story, is so much more interesting than anything you'll find in a history textbook. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden truth about Catherine the Great, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold histories. In the comments, let me know what other historical figures you want me to investigate. Because trust me, Catherine wasn't the only ruler with secrets. She was just better at using hers than most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.